Good afternoon, everyone. This is Steve Wilson. Today, our webinar for the private well class is for realtors about what you need to know about homes with well water. Hopefully, this is a helpful time to learn why it's important, why wells are important, why how you deal with your either buyer or seller really matters in the long run, especially for their health. So we're at the State Water Survey at the University of Illinois, and the private well class is a program funded by the US EPA and supported by the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, who's our partner. I'll mention them in a little bit and give you more background there. So thanks for joining us today. This webinar is part of our private well class program. The actual class is not these webinars, but a 10-lesson class that you can sign up for at privatewellclass.org. That's delivered once a week for 10 weeks to your email as a PDF. You're free to take it when you want. I mean, it's self-paced, it's free. It's something you should share with any of your customers who have a private well. It's good information for them to understand, especially if they're a first-time well owner, if they're buying a new home or buying a home with a well. We're going to answer a bunch of the questions that folks asked today in advance, or at least some of those. And we'll also have time at the end. We'll stay as long as you stay to answer questions. If you have a question that comes up during the presentation today, you can put that in the chat box or the question box that's on your GoToWebinar window. Katie Buckley's monitoring that and is creating a list of those questions, and we'll pull those up at the end. So yeah, and if we can't answer a question, which certainly happens, if you're willing to email us, we will find an answer in general. If we need to talk to some other experts or whatever, we'll help you get to get the information you're looking for. That's our job. So if you're an EHP, environmental health professional, we are a CE provider, continuing education provider. And so the way that works with NEHA, the National Environmental Health Association, is that you can't take the same class more than once every credentialing cycle, which is 2 years. So I just throw this example up that if your credentialing cycle ended on 8/31, so on 9/1 of 24, you started a 2-year cycle. After today, you can't take this class again until after 9/1/26, when you'd be in a new cycle again. And so we do offer this at least once a year. Typically, in the last two are listed there. Actually, 8/2/22 is more than 2 years ago, so it should not be an issue. But if you were on this webinar last year in September, then you can't get credit for it again if you're still in the same credentialing cycle. All right. What we can provide you is the certificate of attendance. You just have to email us a copy of the slide deck if you're interested in that, as well as we can complete the NEHA, help you complete the NEHA forms. We also are an LEHP provider for Illinois. Since we're based at the University of Illinois, we work with our county health departments a lot. They're very supportive of us. And so we become a licensed provider through the state of Illinois. And so if you're in Illinois or need Illinois credit, this webinar serves that purpose as well. RCAP, I mentioned, they basically fund us. They're the prime grantee on a grant from US EPA to provide education and outreach to well owners and professionals that serve them. I want to mention a little about them because as realtors, they're folks you can lean on in your state. I know we've been asked about doing more realtor programs. The problem is every state licenses realtors with their own rules. And so there's no national way for us to become a provider of continuing education for realtors without going to every state, and we just don't have the bandwidth for that. But if you're interested in working with RCAP, especially because of the well assessment program, which I'll mention in a minute, it's really a great way to bring in someone who's a well expert and who can talk to a well owner or a homeowner or someone about to buy a home with a well and do an assessment of what the situation is with every particular well. What I could tell you from all the work that I've done here in Illinois is that every well is different in one way or another, and so understanding all those nuances and issues is really comes with experience. So we have I know a few realtors who actually do a lot of homes, sell a lot of homes, or people buy homes that are on wells, but there's many who just do that every once in a while and may not have that experience. So I'm not sure what just happened there. So one of the things I mentioned, an assessment. So there's this well assessment tool that we developed with a group of experts, private well experts from around the country, and it's got 18 sections. I'm just going to show a couple, but it's a way to meet with a homeowner individually and go through all the possible issues that could affect well water quality, which is really we're looking at public health protection here in the end. And so it's really worthwhile. You really have to have some wherewithal in order to fill this out. It's not for anyone. It really needs to be someone who has experience. And you'd see as you get into this, there's a small section on septic systems, and I show that today because we've recently developed a separate assessment tool that's just about septic and on-site wastewater systems. And so this just asks a few questions, but there's a whole form now available for that as well. And RCAP is implementing that out in the field all around the country. So it's like a sanitary survey, which is what communities have to do. They have to have their water system inspected. That's a legal requirement. This is voluntary, but it's also really a chance to educate well owners. And if you tag along as a realtor, I'm sure you would learn a lot too about all the different issues that might affect the well. It'd be good even to have at a realtor meeting, one of the RCAP folks attend and give a presentation about the assessments tool and all the pieces it has in it and why they're all important and why they need to understand those things. It's also a chance to promote best practices to a well owner if they're not following those. You run into wells where there's a Folgers can on top of the well instead of a sanitary well cap, or they have their dog tied up to the wellhead. Those just are not good ideas in general, especially if it's a shallow well where shallow infiltration might affect water quality. And it's, again, a chance to encourage communication and help a well owner just learn how to be a better well owner, as well as that's what our class is for, that you can sign up for those 10 lessons. So they've done about 4,000 of these across the country. A lot of times in support of a state or local health group, whether it's a county health department or a local health district. Whenever they have a problem well, they don't have the manpower to go out and investigate what's going on. Sometimes they'll call their local RCAP folks and ask them to go out and do an assessment and help them understand, and the well owner understand what the issues are and what their options are. But it's also, again, RCAP is a partner for all of you as professionals, that they can certainly support what you're doing, working with well owners, and help you understand why what we're going to talk about today is so important. I mentioned that we had a wastewater tool or a septic assessment tool. It's called the On-Site Wastewater Treatment System Assessment. It in itself is a number of pages long and goes over a lot more detail. Septic systems can certainly be a problem for water quality, or if they're not managed properly. If septic can back up into your home, the drain field gets clogged, then it's a very big expense for a homeowner to have to find another place for their septic field, if that's even possible. So it's really important to take care of it. And we actually have a webinar once a year. We had it in July, just on septic systems and all those issues. And it's recorded. You can find it on our YouTube channel for the private well class. So we're at the Water Survey. I always try to say something about us because we're unique as an agency in the country. Every state has a state geological survey, as well as does Illinois. But we also have a water survey that was started in 1895 because of cholera and typhoid outbreaks, and the understanding that those were probably waterborne issues. And so we have files going back to 1895, including we house the state's well logs. And so our groundwater and my section, environmental public health section, we work with well owners in Illinois almost daily. And we do research studies sometimes where we're actually contacting well owners in Illinois and asking them if we can come out and sample their water and some of those things, looking at different health issues and public health needs related to private wells and folks drinking their drinking water that's not treated like a community water supply is. So just a couple of pictures from our old files. This is from 1913, a young man helping a water survey chemist do some analysis. It's just pretty interesting how things are. Pana, Illinois had a typhoid outbreak in 1916. I show this a lot because we have all the records for this in our files, including all the newspaper clippings from the Pana Palladium, where the ice cream company that ended up being the source of the typhoid really had a problem with the fact that the investigation led back to them, and put a lot of information in the paper that's kind of fun to read. We've done testing. There you see the sample kit in the back. There used to be a lot of these hand pump wells in parks and communities. That was actually outlawed eventually, but you can see that tin cup sitting there. That just stayed there on the ground or wherever, and when you needed a drink of water, you start pumping the hand pump, you use the tin cup. You might rinse it out, but still it sat there. And those hand pumps, it's a piston pump, so water sets in the column, and with no backflow device or anything to protect water that might be sitting and exposed to air, those are really a bacterial problem for sure. Wow, I thought I just took this out. We're not doing a poll question today. It's kind of odd, but right before we started, I thought I took this slide out. That's the way it goes. So we'll move on. So today, I'm Steve Wilson. I'm a groundwater hydrologist here at the survey. Katie Buckley's with us. She's a water research engagement specialist. She's been with our program almost since it started. And so she's monitoring any questions you might have that you put in the question box or the chat box. And she's also the person who will help with the certificates and continuing education questions afterward. So, and just so everyone's aware, I probably didn't say this, but we do take giving CEs seriously. And so, GoToWebinar records how long you're on, how attentive you are, all those sorts of things. And we actually use that and have a threshold if you want to get credit or a certificate for that. So, we just expect everybody to pay attention, I guess. And we also have Sally Dolan and Aaron Huggett with us today, who are part of our team. They manage our hotline and help center, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but it's something we started new in April. It's funded by US EPA, and it's actually available. You can get to it from EPA's private well page on their website, as well as through ours. But it's a much more robust way for us to get questions, answer questions when people call us or need assistance or want help. And I'll talk about that a little bit today, but those are folks, if you call, probably who you would talk to first. So today we're going to talk about what are the issues that are important to home buyers and sellers, right? So it's really a matter of what are the basics. I know like someone asked a question like, why should I tell people to do a home inspection or a well inspection? Well, hopefully today will help answer that question. So we'll talk about some construction basics because there's a lot of things people don't understand about the differences in wells and how that affects what kind of risks they might have, especially from surface contaminants. And then just some basic water quality information, as well as we'll go through some of the questions you all asked at the second part of this webinar. The thing to remember as a well owner or to tell a well owner is that they're not regulated. So in the Safe Drinking Water Act regulates community water supplies and non-community water supplies so that they have to sample, they have to have a licensed operator, they have to treat the water to make sure it meets certain conditions and contaminants are under certain levels. So for instance, the arsenic standard through the Safe Drinking Water Act is 10 parts per billion. So every state has to monitor all their public water supplies and ensure that the water they're serving to their customers, the residents in a town, like now I live on a community water supply. I used to live on a farm with a well, but that water has to have less than 10 parts per billion of arsenic when it's sent out through to my home. That's not the case for any public water supplies or for any private wells. There are a few states that require testing at property transfer, and we're actually going to talk about that. But in general, you're on your own as a well owner. And so that's the message that you need to make clear. Some people get so worried about that they choose not to even look at a home on a private well. What I would say there is you need to test and you need to understand what the water quality is. Many private wells are perfectly safe, provide safe drinking water, but it's a matter of knowing and knowing and being sure ahead of time, or even if it's a constituent like arsenic, there's ways to treat that and that aren't that expensive, and you're ensuring that it's okay for your family to drink that kind of water. So the other thing to remember is it could be the best tasting, look the safest in the world, but many contaminants can be odorless, colorless, tasteless. And so arsenic's a good example of that. You can't see it, smell it, taste it, but if it's in your water, it can be a problem. So today I live in a community water supply, as I mentioned, and I pay 50 to 70. Now I have a 13-year-old daughter, so it's more like 70 to 80 every month for the cost of my water. That's not really cheap. There's some smaller towns, I'm sure, that have much lower water rates, but that's the cost spread out over all the residents in our community to sample the water, to treat it, sample the treated water and make sure it's safe to distribute out to our customers, maintain all that piping and infrastructure so that when I turn on my tap, I have water pressure, I have safe water I can put in a glass and drink, and I don't have to worry about any of those things. And again, every private well owner has those responsibilities and they need to understand that. And our wastewater rates, so our sewer lines and stuff are all based on our water use. And so our sanitary district that we pay for our sewer services bases our bi-monthly charges on what our water bill is. And so it's a direct relationship with how much water we use is how much is assumed as there's a process for that, and that's an accepted method. Some do it differently, but all those things matter. So you need to make sure that your clients understand the issues that come with owning a well, whether they're the buyer or the seller. If you're the seller, poor construction or poor water quality will reduce the value of home. Even though they may require some upfront costs for repair or adding treatment, there's certain things like FHA or HUD loans you may not even be able to get, and more mortgage companies and others in banks are requiring a water test, and even more significant water tests than even a few years ago. And so it's best to do all that up front. And so on the buyer side, I try to tell people it's buyer beware. I can't count how many people have called me and said, I bought this home, they said the water was safe, and it turned out there's some other reason for that. Like they only tested for coliform nitrate. And so many people believe because we tell people to sample once a year for coliform nitrate, that means their well is safe. No, what that actually means is that their well is safe from surface contaminants, because if you have coliform nitrate in your well, it means there's probably a source at the surface that's able to get in the well. And so it's really a test for how well your well construction and well is sealed. It doesn't mean you don't have arsenic. It doesn't mean you don't have any other natural occurring contaminant, or that if there's some source under the ground, or you're in an area where the geology is vulnerable, that you might not still have other risks. And so for the buyer, it is buyer beware. I would always recommend testing. I would always recommend having an inspection, but you need to know those things up front. And if I'm representing the seller, if you have an old well and you have those issues, if you mitigate that in advance, you have arsenic in your water system or in your well water. If you add, either some kind of filter or an RO unit so that the drinking water and water for cooking is free from arsenic, that'll help your home sell and shows that you're diligent and you're being upfront and all of those things. Yeah, and it's really a matter of how you approach being the representative for a buyer or seller. And I look at it like you're a lawyer representing your client. You need to do best by them, and that doesn't just mean money. It means making sure that there won't be issues down the road. New Jersey has the longest standing private well testing act, and this is an old photo. I left it in, or an old screenshot. Their page has changed a lot. I was just on it yesterday. But they have, for over 20 years, they've required testing at property sale. And what that means is that the way this was set up is that in the beginning, New Jersey State Lab had to do the analysis. They collected the sample. The buyer and the seller had to agree on who was going to pay the $600 fee, and the results only went to the buyer and seller. And I think that's still the case. They actually map some of that data, but they do it on a grid, 2-mile grid, so that no individual homes are shown online. And so what that's done for New Jersey is it's allowed them to collect information on water quality, about 13,000 samples a year. There's 13,000 property transfers a year. And one, as a scientist, for me, if we had 13,000 analysis every year for the last 20 years throughout the state when a home is sold, that's amazing information to understand our groundwater quality, what our risks are, where we need to focus on protecting public health, all those things. And so it's a good program from that standpoint. Obviously, it requires someone to pay up front, but it's actually seems better to do that as part of the sale than requiring someone after or before, where you're already out laying out that sort of money. Yeah, I won't go through this, but it's you can go to their webpage and see a lot of those rules. There's a number of states now that are doing that, including Oregon and I believe Rhode Island. They have their own laws and they do things in different ways. There might be one other state, I want to say it's Connecticut, but I'm not sure. But as far as when sampling is required, this is becoming a little more commonplace. It started in New Jersey and now there's 4 or 5 states that do it. There's some states that are kind of different, if you will, just because of their political nature. For instance, Pennsylvania, they have not passed any laws that require licensed drillers to maintain a license and take continuing education. They don't have a set well construction code that requires certain types of materials or methods for drilling wells. Those seem like much more basic needs. There's only 2 states that don't have those rules, and they're Pennsylvania and Alaska. And so getting to a point where you're having the state legislature or your state politicians agree to require testing are probably a long way off, if ever. And that's likely the case in Illinois, just because we're such an agricultural state. And the ag lobby is really strong in our state as far as their influence on our, all in our laws and rules. And so it really kind of just depends. You need to look at that for where you live. I also mentioned Rhode Island. What's interesting here is they require, the required tests are up there on the top left or top right, but their law is a little different. It's tied, and I don't show it here, I don't think, but I know the testing results are tied to their home inspectors program. And in extreme cases, if they see the well water quality as a risk, they can declare that property uninhabitable until there's mitigation to add treatment or do what they need to make the water safe to drink. And so in the other states, there's no state influence on forcing treatment or any of those things. That's really up to the buyer and seller. But in Rhode Island, they can actually have some influence there. And it's just a good thing to know if you're working in that state. But it's also meant to protect public health again and protect the value of a home, which is why we're seeing more and more, like HUD and mortgage companies and everybody else requiring more and more testing prior to sale. They're trying to protect their investment, which is what you should do as well, because your investment is in your client. And if you don't do right by them, it won't take long before that comes back to affect your business. There's also places where locally they have authority. Westchester County, they actually have the right to require testing. Especially in the Northeast, there's a lot of home rule states where the local health district has the authority to pass their own laws. And what that's led to, I'll use Massachusetts as an example. There are 351 local health districts in Massachusetts. Every one of them can pass their own rules. So you could have one health district that requires testing at property transfer or has the authority even to condemn a well, where across the street, it's another water authority or a public health district, and they have no rules that require anything. And so as a realtor and a home buyer, you really need to understand where you're moving to and what effects that may have on those issues. So, I used to be able to tell folks all over the country, there's no health department that can condemn your well. You should go to them for advice. And what I say today is that that's 99% true, but there's a few places where you should call them first and ask them what authority they have. And maybe if you want advice, you can find it in other places until because it would be a real hardship on a homeowner to have their well condemned when they may not be able to do anything about that. And they should have all the information in front of them, in my opinion, before they have to take that step. So it's, again, you're their agent. As a realtor, you need to be up on these things. So whether you represent the buyer or the seller, you should do an inspection of the well and the water system. You need to test the water and inform your client and be informed. And so we're going to talk about those things. That's the bottom line. I do want to talk about the types of wells because they really matter. A Duggar bored well is typically put in when there is no real, quote, aquifer, either sand and gravel aquifer or a bedrock aquifer that produces enough water or water that's of the right quality. For instance, in Southern Illinois, we have no deep bedrock wells because the water in our deeper bedrock in Southern Illinois, a million years ago, it was an ocean, and it's salt water. So the salt level is like 11,000. The TDS is 11,000 total dissolved solids. It tastes like salt water, like you're drinking out of the Pacific Ocean. And so it's not potable, it has to be treated. And so you see either, at least for communities in Southern Illinois, they're all tied to the same large water district that comes from a lake. But private well owners don't have that same option. So a lot of them have these shallow, large diameter wells that are either hand dug, like the one I grew up on, that was only 14 feet deep, or they're bored with a machine like this one. If you look under those gentlemen's feet, you can tell there's a circle down there on the ground. That's a boring machine that cuts a 3.5-inch diameter hole. And when they dig that out, they'll go until they hit either a thin layer of sand or the water table, and so it's saturated, and so they're standing water in that hole, and then they'll put a concrete tile, at least a lot of them are, in that hole to create, basically you're creating like a cistern. If you know what that is, it stores water. And so it may seep in slowly, but it's got a large volume so that You can use it in the morning when everyone's taking showers. It draws the water way down. During the day, it slowly fills back up, and then you have it again at night, and it's kind of that kind of process. And typically water's seeping in from either the water table, as I mentioned, or thin sand lenses. And not to get into the weeds, but in certain places, if you start digging a hole in the ground, you may get to 3 or 4 feet, and all of a sudden you have water in your hole. And even though it's clay, it may not be provide a lot of water. That's where the water table is. That's where the ground becomes saturated below that point. And it isn't an aquifer. You can't pump it and get a lot of water out of it, but you still have to deal with the fact that it's saturated and that there's water below that level in the pore spaces between all the grains of the sand, silt, and clay and geologic material. These are all examples of border dug wells. The one on the right is kind of a typical construction for many years. Those are 3-foot sections of tile, or 3-foot diameter tile that's 4-foot sections. They're placed vertically and they just set on top of each other. So every one of the seams has a little gap where water can seep in. And I'll show that on a diagram in a second. That can have a concrete pad like that one does at the surface, or a newer construction is to put that pad 10 feet or more below land surface so that you can fill in around the well and help protect it from surface influence. Something spilled right next to this well is going to slide down the outside edge and actually get to one of those seams and could be get into your well and be a problem. The well on the top left is an old hand dug well. So it's covered with some 2x10s wood and tin with bricks on it and concrete blocks. You can see how the ground is all wet and gnarly there. Those posts are all worn down because that's a cattle pasture, and the cows come up and use those posts as scratching posts, and then they do their business there as well. And all that's seeping into the ground around the well. This well's probably been here since the 40s or earlier, and it's still used. When we took this picture, I guess that would have been about 25 years ago now, but it was still in use at the time for the house that's up on top of that hill. They don't have a well at their house because it's all clay and there was no aquifer. So they went down the hill and found a spot where they found a thin sand, and they dug a well then, probably by hand. No different than the well I grew up on. We had a small farm. My grandpa hand dug it in 1933. He picked a spot that was in the middle of a ravine because he knew water would run towards the well, not understanding that all that surface water brings contaminants with it and stuff. So these are the two current construction methods, or just kind of a diagram of what they look like in Illinois. The one on the left is where the concrete pad's all the way up to the surface. These days we don't have pipes coming up out of the top. There's a pitless adapter like the one shown on the right there's an elbow and it stays underground to the home, and that's so that those pipes won't freeze in the winter. We do have freezing weather in Illinois, and so there's a frost line, and you keep the pipes below that so you don't have to worry about freezing in the middle of winter. But these wells, they're 36-inch diameter. The little triangle is where the water line is. And so you have these little sand lenses where water can seep in, and you can see the sections of the tile where they have the little lips shown on those, and they kind of fit together, but they're not watertight or airtight, and so water can seep in around that. And again, when you start pumping water from the well, the water level drops in the well, which makes all the water around the well start to move toward the well because the water level in the soil is higher. And so it's going to try to move to be level like it does in your bathtub. And it just refills, but it fills slowly. And so the real point of this is that a dug or bored well typically is large diameter so that it can store more water. A drilled well, which we'll show in a second, might be 5 inches in diameter the entire depth, because you don't rely on the well holding water in it. You rely on the aquifer outside the well to be able to provide water into the well through a screen or an open hole. Okay. I feel like I'm forgetting something here, but I don't know what that would be, so we're going to move on. So a sand and gravel well is just how it sounds. It's a well that's finished so that it's getting water from a sand and gravel geologic layer. These are generally prolific. If you had a jar of sand in your hand, about 20 to 30% of that jar is actually airspace because of the way the grains fit together. And so in an aquifer, that airspace is filled up with water. So if you have a 100 feet thick layer of sand that's all saturated and underground, if you took all the sand away, you'd still have 20 to 30 feet of water available in that space, which is a lot. So you see sand and gravel wells used for irrigation along river lowlands, along rivers where it's all sandy, because they can pump. In some cases, you have a 12 or 14 or 16-inch well that can pump 1 to 2,000 gallons a minute, where a home is only using 5 to 15 gallons a minute at most. But the way they're done is it's a solid pipe for the well casing until you get to the screen, which is at the bottom. And so the well is finished somewhere in the lower part of the sand and gravel aquifer, and it's got a 4 or 5 foot screen, and water seeps in through that those woven pieces of stainless steel there. That's one woven, so the space there is a certain size. It's and so the screen size, which is really based on the open space between any two of those pieces of stainless steel, is based on the size of the sand grains. So if you have a larger gravel, you can have a larger space. If it's fairly fine sand, then you'd have a much narrower space there, because the screen is supposed to keep the sand out and let the water in. This is a typical well log for, at least for Illinois, and the information we gather. Some of the things that when you're working with someone that's going to possibly get a property with a well, or someone who has selling a house with a well, depending on the state and how old the well is, hopefully the log would be available. You should find that and have that available. So in this case, number 5, it's a 15 gallon per minute pump. They estimated the yield at 40 gallons per minute. Number 3 there, this is a newer wells from 2014. They went 295 feet. If you look at the bottom right, they hit sand that says sand tight, sand, and then sand and gravel. These were all, these sand and gravel layers were all left by glaciers. And so when you think about how if materials picked up by a fast moving stream, the bigger particles fall out first, and then as the stream slows down, the smaller particles fall out as they can. And so you typically have layered sand. If you have, in this case, you have sand from 260 down to 295. So in that 35 feet, the very top of that sand is going to be really tiny, fine sand. It was the last to be deposited, where at the very bottom is the first to be deposited when the water was running much faster and harder as glaciers were melting. And so you have sand and gravel, and it's larger particles. And so typically they'll drill through that tight sand or the fine sand down to something that's much more manageable for a well screen, and they'll put the well there. And you can see with number 22, they use steel casing, different scheduled pipe, from 1 foot above land surface down to 291, and then they have a 4 foot or a 5 foot, I'm sorry, it says, that's 5-inch diameter, a 4 foot stainless steel screen. That's the slot size is 20. It's 20 hundredths of an inch, I believe. And they're getting their water from sand and gravel. They're saying it's the sand and gravel layer that's from 285 to 295. It's actually all of that sand is contributing that whole 35 feet of sand. But with a sand and gravel well, water's only coming in at the screen, and that really matters. That means at this location, this is in Champaign County where I live, it's solid pipe from ground surface down to 291, or 290, I guess, yeah, or no, 291. And so water cannot get in the well until 291 feet below land surface. That's awesome for protecting the well and the well water from surface contaminants. You have to grout the well in a well like this. And again, this is a 5-inch diameter well. And when you drill the hole, it might be 6 7/8 or some other diameter that's a little larger so that you can get the casing in. But then you have to backfill around the outside of the well, and there's certain requirements for the type of material you use to do that. Usually it's a slurry, a liquid slurry of bentonite clay or cement or a mixture, and that prevents, when that hardens, it's solid, nothing can get through it, and it prevents any water from the surface running down along the outside of the casing and getting into the well through the screen. So this is typically, if it's well constructed, we actually know Mark Layton, there's really no chance of surface influence getting this well unless, something happened, like the well was hit by a mower or a vehicle, or something cracked the casing somehow. And so it's pretty safe, and you're only getting your water at this depth. And so this is another page of that same log. This is some software this company's using. And so it kind of gives you an idea. The static water level is 159 feet. So even though the sand isn't until 260, when you put a well there, water levels rise all the way up to 159. Think of a juice box. If you squeeze it, what happens? The juice comes out the straw. So somewhere there's pressure on the water system in that sand and gravel aquifer that's causing the water level to rise up that high, and that's very typical. It means it's under artesian pressure, and we see that a lot with glacial aquifers. So there's a lot of water in the well. It's not just, it'd take a lot to pump that well dry probably. So the difference with a bedrock well is, water doesn't exist in rock per se, right? If I had a solid piece of rock in my hand and I asked you how much water was in that versus the jar of sand, if it had water in it, the jar would have 20 to 30% water. A rock has basically none, depending on the type of rock, but very little. You're actually getting the water from a bedrock aquifer from the fractures in the rock and the cracks in the rock. And that's what this diagram shows. It shows some of these bedrock fractures. So in order to take advantage of that, you can't have a solid casing over around the well all the way down, because then you couldn't get water from the fractures. So typically a bedrock well goes 10 to 20 feet into the bedrock, and then it stops. And the rest of the drilling, the hole that's been drilled, is an open hole. And so in this diagram, you can see it shows steel casing 10 to 20 feet into bedrock, and after that, the casing's gone, and that hole full of water is just the rock itself acts as the casing, but it means that those fractures near the bottom are open to the well, and they're pushing the water up. You can see it's up in almost where the cutaway stops. And what that means, though, is it's almost like pipe flow. So it can be, if there's only a few fractures, water can be coming from much further away. It can also mean that it, in this case, you see these fractures are diagonal, they're not flat, which is typical. Water could be coming from a fracture that goes up close to the surface. So even though your well might be 600 feet deep in this case, and this is a case in New York. I worked in northern New York, up along the St. Lawrence, in that area, where they have some really deep wells, but bedrock's near the surface. And so even though the well's really deep, it's because there's just not a lot of water available. Water can get into some of those wells as soon as the casing stops. And some of the older wells, before they had rules requiring you to have casing to a certain depth, I found wells that only had 12 foot of casing. It means water can get in the well anywhere from 12 feet down to 600, which just isn't as safe. And so understanding if it's a bedrock well, how much casing is there is really one of the critical factors, not the well depth. It may not matter, so that's kind of why it's important to know some of those things about the well. If you can find the log, especially if I'm representing a buyer, I'd want to know all of that information before as well as the water test, obviously. So here's a typical bedrock well. This is actually a larger well. It's for a camp. I mean, it's not that large, but if you look at the same material, they had in the end, they put in a 12 gallon per minute pump at 160. In this case, if you look at number 18 on the bottom right, they hit broken limestone, which is the top of the rock, was at 187. And then the bedrock, the limestone with all the fractures in it, went down to 257. And then they got into some shale, which is basically cemented clay. And so they stopped. You're not going to get water out of that. And so the water here is coming from the limestone. And if you look at the number 15, they use PVC pipe because it's cheaper for the first 179 feet. And then they put 20 feet of steel casing in down to 199, which is basically 10 feet into the rock, and they stopped. So from 199 down to 260, there is no casing. And if there's any fractures in that limestone, they're available to a pump that can pump water from that borehole. And so in this case, the water level rose up to 130 feet. I'm on number 17 on this diagram. And when they pumped it for an hour at 25 gallons per minute, for 2 hours at 25 gallons a minute, it dropped to 160. So the amount of drawdown in a well is directly proportional to the pumping rate. And so since they knew they weren't going to pump this at 25 gallons a minute, they used a larger pump so they could be sure that when they finish this well and they put a 12 gallon per minute pump in, they'd probably be safe at 160. It's not going to draw down that much. So yeah, that's all that information is available for a lot of wells, especially these days, if it's a newer well, or if someone's going to install a new well. That's one thing I probably have never mentioned on this webinar, is that if this is for a home that's being built and they're going to put in a well, make sure that the contract with the driller includes that the homeowner get a copy of the log and all the work that was done to clean it. If there's any testing required at installation, like we have in Illinois, that they get a copy of that, because in some states, there aren't laws that require, they aren't as rigorous, and it may be that the driller has the log, but no one else does. And the homeowner needs to be sure they can get a copy of that log. So well type really matters. Hopefully that was clear, because of the geology. You know, a Duggar bored well, again, it's not really an aquifer. It's usually that it's water seeping in slowly. And a lot of times those are very old, like those old hand dug wells that are brick lined. That's what I grew up on. I understand those risks there. We actually had frogs in our well one time. Not an ideal situation. But in some cases, you may even have choices. So here in Champaign County, almost all of the wells are in a large glacial sand and gravel aquifer because it's got plenty of water, and though it's hard and has a lot of iron in it, it's a good water source. But if somebody wanted to drill down through the sand and gravel into the bedrock, there's also water in the bedrock aquifer here. It's just, there's no need to. Why spend the extra money to drill that deep for water that is of not better quality, and there's no need for it. But in some cases, you might have 2 or 3 aquifers to choose from, and the water quality could make a difference. And so finding that information out, or knowing, most of the local drillers and contractors should have an idea. But it also matters who you're dealing with. Sometimes they only drill into one type of aquifer, whether that be sand and gravel or bedrock, and they're not going to do the other type. And so all that matters. There's a lot to think about with all of this. And so it's really best if you have a log, so that you know where your water's coming from, because then you also have other resources like your state agency that licenses drillers or maintains well logs, or that looks at groundwater quality. That might be a DEQ, a DNR, Department of Health, or even a state geological survey or a USGS office, where they do a lot of that kind of work, where they make maps of water quality of groundwater systems, and knowing what that is. Any of those folks you can call, and they can help you with, if they don't know the answer to, what's the water quality at this location, they will know who has actually worked on things like that, and maybe has a general idea of the water quality in that particular aquifer. Not necessarily at the location, but it's going to be fairly similar if it's not too far away. The other thing is well construction. There most well construction codes didn't come along until like the late 60s, early 70s. In some states, it's much later than that, as far as 2000, and also requiring logs to be filed. And so what that's meant is that all the existing wells and anyone who had a well that prior to that, those were grandfathered in, and they probably don't meet code and they may be more at risk. We still see a lot of wells in pits, and that's because until the 60s, when the pitless adapter was invented, wells were put in pits in cold climates so that they were below the frost line in the winter and pipes didn't freeze. So we did a study where we inventoried about 1,700 wells in 9 townships in a rural part of Illinois, and I think we found at least 60 or 80 wells that were still in a pit. And we tell people they should extend the casing and bring that up and make that meet code today, because it's dangerous in a lot of ways. And even these old hand dug wells, which are still in use, and not only do they allow surface contamination to get in like a hard rain, it could even fill up one of those pits. They're also a safety hazard. So here's 2 examples. The picture on the right, that's a dead goat. I was down in Southern Illinois for a meeting with irrigation folks, and I ran into Don Kelderman, who was there researching his family history. And he'd found this well near a cemetery where someone put a concrete tile over the old stone walls, but it had nothing over it. It was only 6 inches above land surface, and it wasn't in use, thankfully, anymore. But somebody's goat had gotten out and managed to find their way in there. So you think that that's only one story. We've even had people on our webinars who said, hey, what do I do? We went out to visit my dad. His water smelled funny. We opened up the old well, and you could see all the snakes moving around in the bottom. These things happen a lot more than you think. And just like the dug well that I showed earlier that had all the tin on top of it, snakes, rats, even raccoons, other things can get in and fall in. And obviously those are a bacterial problem. You don't know what they're carrying. As that rots, it creates other kinds of problems. It's just not having a proper well casing or having it sealed properly at the top, because that's the way someone's chosen to live for the last 50 years, doesn't mean it's the way it should be. Washington State Department of Ecology is the state agency in Washington State that regulates drillers and well construction. For a while, I don't know if they still do it, they had a blog, and I followed it, and this picture came from that. This is an old well house with an old well inside it where they had a piece of plywood over the top of it. You can see the blue pump there, so it's a suction pump. The water's shallow. That little funnel is probably to put oil in, just laying there. All that gray stuff on the back, I'm guessing that's old insulation that's either rotted or been chewed on by rats. And half of that plywood's gone because she broke and she fell in and it killed her. There's a lot more of these out there than you realize. Because it's in a little building doesn't make it okay. Yeah, it's a shame. You know, these things occur a lot more than people realize. And this is just a totally unsafe well for anyone to be using for their potable water supply. So what should you do? If you run into a well that's a risk, you should bring it up to code. In some cases that's possible. Some cases it may mean a new well. But if it's in a pit, and say it's a sand and gravel well with a 5-inch casing like the one we looked at, you can have that pipe extended up to the surface, put in a pitless in place of the top of the casing where the pipe's coming out. And a pitless adapter basically is an elbow that allows you to have a pump in a well and to be able to pull it. And also it forms a seal so that in normal use, the pump, when it pumps water up the drop pipe, it elbows 4 or 5 feet below land surface and then goes horizontally to the home. And there's a lot of folks you can talk to locally In some cases, there may be a well authority, but even a contractor. But your county extension, even your state agency, you can search, well logs or driller licensing, or even, all those things. Or even a state agency that deals with groundwater, like here, the water survey where I'm at, we happen to also be, we house all the state's well logs, but if you called and asked about certain things, we certainly know who you could contact if it wasn't under our expertise. And you just have to be inquisitive. There are folks, especially as a realtor, you should get to know, so that when you do have questions, you've got a source. It's really a good business practice to have someone really available that you develop confidence in, that understands issues related to private wells and all of that. Same thing for abandoned wells. Because well logs weren't required in most states between the 60s and 80s, but again, like New York didn't require logs until 2000. So any well drilled before 2000 in New York State, there's not a well log for it on file with the state, which is like 80 or 90% of the wells that exist in New York State. But we also have wells that were drilled before that are no longer in use, or an old well that was hand dug that someone decided to keep, even though they put in a new well. All those things are a risk. Just like a well in a pit, they're a real safety hazard. If you have an abandoned well that's not being used, your responsibility is to properly abandon it. And as a realtor, you need to ask that question. If there's any identified, figure out how to do that. In a lot of cases, it's not very expensive, but there are rules in most states on how you abandon a well. I'll give a shout out to Iowa. Iowa's legislature passed a law, I think it started in 1986, as I remember. We just talked to their folks just last week. They give grants to their counties to support private homeowners on wells, and that's to abandon wells, to help pay for costs related to collecting a water sample and having it analyzed, among a number of other things. It's really a great program. It's the only state in the country that I know of that has that. But even in Illinois, before the pandemic, our soil and water conservation districts had a cost share program where they would help pay half the cost of abandoning a well, up to about $700, I think. I'm not sure that's been re-implemented, but you need to look and ask, whether it's a watershed district or a soil and water conservation district. There's a lot of different folks that may have some program to help, but the important thing is to have that well abandoned, and also understand that your state may have rules on that say if there's a well that's not been used in so many days or months, it needs to be abandoned, and that could be a finding on a property sale or hold it up because that due diligence wasn't done early on. So some more examples. Both of these pictures are also from the Washington State Department of Ecology in their blog. And the one on the top, they're trying to get a horse out of an old well that wasn't abandoned. So that's a tragedy, right? Especially if it broke its leg or whatever, just because someone decided to leave this and not take care of it. And this Sheldon, Washington man falls 45 feet into a well. He was in his backyard and fell through and fell into this well, had no idea it was there. And amazingly, there was enough water in it, or however he fell, when they pulled him out, he walked away. Very, very fortunate. And all these newspaper clippings are from the 90s. The most famous one there is the third one, Jessica McClure, I think her name was, was a toddler. She was trapped in a well in Texas. It went on national news. CNN covered it live overnight. It took, I don't know if you were old enough to remember that when that happened. It was in the early 90s, I believe. Now she's a mother of 3, but she was very fortunate that she got trapped in a well. It was just big enough for her, and so she didn't get very far down into it when she got stuck. And so they were able to dig that out and get underneath her and get her out. It took like 18 hours, I think. But, when people, especially before the internet, someone in Sangamon County died from falling in a well, and then a girl in I think Buffalo Grove, same thing happened. The people in Buffalo Grove and Sangamon County wouldn't have necessarily even known about the other event because you got everything from your newspaper and your local news. It wasn't on the internet and available to find out what happened in some, local area far away from where you live. And so this stuff happens more than you understand, and you have a responsibility when working with a homeowner on a property to make sure that these risks aren't there. Because in the end, if you have an old well that's not sealed and someone falls into it, the property owner is probably going to be liable anyway, even if they were trespassing. And so, or if it gets contaminated, folks see that big hole in the ground and think, hey, that's a good place to throw my empty containers or whatever. I know we did a well sealing demonstration with some of the county health departments in Illinois, and we videoed that and created a video on best practices related to that. This was a well that was in a backyard in Macomb, Illinois, which is a town of 16,000. And the well was, the property was only 4 blocks from the town square. They'd had city water since 1916, and someone bought this property and they realized there's this concrete pad right outside their door with a little hole in it that had been where the hand pump was many years ago. And so they called Western Illinois University's geology department. The folks there in the Groundwater Guardians group figured out that it was a 21-foot old hand dug well. And so we abandoned that properly by filling it in and videoed all that. It had probably 10,000 or more cigarette butts in it. So that little 3-inch hole had been there, and the previous property owner had used that as the place to dispose of his cigarette butts. The well was dry, luckily, and so at least at the time. But people just don't understand, and they need to, and you're in a position to actually help them. So you should do an inspection of your water system, whether you're the buyer or the seller. It's better to be prepared to know if they need to make corrections. Again, we tell people who are buying a property they shouldn't buy it until they've done an inspection and had the water tested. And so it can delay things. It can make the property less marketable, all those things. And if you do that in advance, if you represent the seller, then if you need treatment, you can add it. There's a lot of affordable ways to treat water, given whatever constituent it might be, and being able to show a potential buyer that this has all been taken care of and corrected, and you've done your due diligence, will increase their confidence in purchasing a home. Here in Champaign County, we had a family call me about a property they wanted to buy in the country. They'd lived in Champaign in town their entire lives, and they decided to buy a place in the country. Their kids were grown. They just wanted to, have a garden and relax. They were all that. So, I told them what I thought they needed to do. The homeowner at the time threw a fit, didn't want to get the water tested, didn't want to do anything. So they actually paid for it themselves because they really wanted the place. And they even hired a contractor to come out and disinfect the well. And in that process, the testing had shown that there was bacteria in their water. And so in that process, the contractor at the time didn't understand the right way to disinfect the well. I'd given them instructions based on what we tell people, and the contractor admitted he really did it and didn't really know what he was doing. They walked away from the property. And so, no one's happy in that situation. And so, and I'm sure, it certainly didn't give either of the folks who were involved a lot of confidence in their realtors, or to, that none of that, they had to do this on their own, basically. So if you're the buyer, again, it's to protect yourself. It's both to understand if you have, if there's any health risks for your family, or if it's going to affect the property values. All the PFAS stuff that's going on today. I know there's a couple questions about that. I'm going to talk about it when we get to the questions part, but it's really an issue. If, that's why New Jersey doesn't make that data available. They're trying to protect the housing market in a way, right? They only show the data based on 2-mile grids. So if there's arsenic in the area, you'll know it if you're in New Jersey and you want to buy a house there. But again, you'd want to go in and either you have to get a water test anyway, so you'll understand what the situation is, and then you can negotiate with the seller as far as who's going to add treatment, or is this even fixable, which usually it is, and know what other issues there might be. You know, it's just what I put in here in the parentheses. It's informed decision making. It makes it better for everyone. It's clear. No one finds out later that they made a mistake or regrets what they've done. I had a homeowner in Macon County who contacted me. She saw in the news that that there was arsenic in some of the wells in the area, so she decided to have her well tested. She had 5 kids, and her arsenic was 159 ppb, which is 15.9 times the standard for a public water supply. It has to be less than 10. So she called me at the State Water Survey, mad at us, because she'd been told the well was safe because they tested it for coliform and nitrate. You know, I brought that up earlier, not as just a hypothetical. That's, you know, I mean, I took a real chewing until I had a chance to explain all those issues. So it's important if you're buying a property or you're representing the buyer that you make sure they're not buying something that they're going to regret later. I always insist on having a test, no matter what. Some states are proactive. So this is from Wisconsin. This is their property transfer for wells and pressure systems inspection form. So they actually, you know, government gets a bad rap a lot of times, and they do things that seem to be make a lot of work and have a lot of bureaucracy. I will say that also about my university. Sometimes they give us so much to do that's just meeting some silly requirement, in my opinion. But Wisconsin developed this form and said, when there's a property transfer, if you want to have your well inspected, we want you to use a contractor and use this form. We know we spent a lot of time making sure this has all the right information. We don't want you to send us a form. We want you to share it with, you know, the folks that are involved in the transaction. It's totally voluntary to do. We don't want you to send us anything. You don't have to pay anything to us. But if you're going to do it, you have to use a well contractor who is licensed and understands the issues. And you have to include that information so that everyone's in the know about what might be the issues. And they update this form every time they change their well construction code. So you can imagine that, as an example, those 2 pictures I showed of the dug wells, or the bored wells earlier from Illinois, it used to be that the code said it had to be just one of those. And then later they realized that starting the well 10 foot below land surface was probably more protective. So they changed the code and added that in. So they, in Wisconsin, if they did that same thing, they would have changed this form to match what's on the code today. And in the end, what you have, I think there's another one. Yeah, this is the other part of that page. In the end, what you have is you have a document that the inspector has to sign, the licensed well driller or pump installer. They have to provide their license, date, phone number, all that stuff. And you're basically guaranteed that if there's some issue that you weren't aware of, it's going to be on the licensed water well contractor, and the state's going to be aware. So it creates a system where you're getting all the information you need to make an informed decision about the well on this property, and you have some teeth behind it should it turn out that something was left off, something wasn't explained. They're expected to do the job right. And so everyone should use this form. And now, again, this is based on Wisconsin's well construction code. So it has pieces in here that may not quite meet every code in the country, but it's something similar is a great idea. And it says it's not, you know, at the bottom here, based on my personal inspection, it complies or does not comply with the Wisconsin well code. Because it doesn't apply doesn't mean it's not okay. It means you know that it doesn't meet current code. It could be something as simple as, and I don't know the rule in Wisconsin, let's say that a well has to be 18 inches, the top of the casing has to be at least 18 inches above land surface. It may be that it's only 14 inches. It's settled, or for whatever reason, or maybe the whoever installed it just didn't do that, or maybe it's only 6 inches because for whatever reason. So if that's not in an area that's prone to flooding, or if it's on a high spot where there's no way there's going to be ponding water, that being less than 18 inches probably isn't a big deal. Or you could even have a contractor come out and extend the casing higher. But if it's something significant, you're going to know it. And so I recommend, this is the approach to take, so that again, everyone's in the know, everyone is on the up and up. And if something goes wrong, or there's something that was not shared, then you have some recourse. Because the woman in Macon County, she wanted to know who she can contact and what she could do. She only bought her home 2 years before that. And so it's too late. It's on her. She has to figure out what to do next, which was to add treatment so that her kids weren't drinking water with arsenic in it. Every state that has a well construction code also has some kind of setback distance requirements for things. I use the one from Minnesota in all of our webinars whenever I talk about this, just because it's pretty comprehensive, it's visual, it's easy to understand, and it really makes you think, why would I care if there's a vertical heat exchanger within 35 feet of my well? Or why, if I go down to the bottom half of this, why does it matter that it's more than 3 feet from a building or a building overhang? Well, there's a lot of reasons for a lot of these things. We've seen wells in basements, in kitchens, in garages, where they build a garage around their well, or, a lot of things that don't necessarily make sense. And if you have a submersible pump, the only way to get that pump out is to pull the drop pipe and pump up using, it's a contracting rig. It's not a drill rig, but it's got a boom, and it has to be able to set up over top of the well. So if you're too close to a building, or you put a building near your well after the fact, you may not be able to get your pump out. I had a case in Kankakee County where the homeowner, their well was in a pit. They needed a garage. They basically poured a concrete slab over top of their well and put a building on top of that, not understanding that the first time there's any issue, they're not going to be able to get to it without either tearing up the concrete and the building. They're more likely to just put in a new well in that case. And it's just folks not understanding the implications of what having a well means. So again, yeah, this, I guess I wanted to show this a second time just because a lot of those things were on that figure that I just showed from Minnesota. So again, the other thing is test the water. If you need to add treatment, it's better to do it up front and make it a selling point versus having what happened here where the person didn't want to spend, the $200 to get a water sample. They lost the sale in that case, or it could cause a lot of problems. And again, if you're the buyer, it's buyer beware. That's the message I have. It's buyer beware. If you, we've had people call us from markets that are, so dynamic that they might get 3 offers the first day, and they're like, well, what do you want me to do? If I don't put an offer on this today, then I'm not gonna get the house. I'm like, well, that's up to you. But if it turns out that that well has arsenic in it or some other constituent, or this was in the Northeast, uranium or whatever, you might be putting several $1,000s worth of treatment in your home and needing to test it regularly to make sure that it's actually working for the rest of your life, instead of knowing up front that that's the case. And I added in here test for chlorine, because if it's an old well, especially like the one I grew up on, and this is a personal story because my dad did this when they sold our farm, which I'm ashamed of, but he disinfected our well knowing very well that within 2 or 3 weeks, it would probably be contaminated again, just so it could pass the inspection. And so if you have, when you're sampling a well, you're sampling a property for water quality for a property sale, you should always test for chlorine to make sure that it wasn't just disinfected, very recently, such that it would pass and there's not a bacteria problem. And so, and that was, 35 years ago, by the way. But Yeah. My dad and I disagreed about a lot of things, including that. So there's lenders who require testing now. I'm sure most of you as realtors are aware of that. There's rules for FHA, HUD, and VA loans through HUD. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So yeah. So 2 examples. The bottom one is the woman in Macon County. Why doesn't the state do more to protect me and my family? You know, the rules are what they are. Private wells are purposely left out of the Safe Drinking Water Act, which requires community water supplies to meet all these rules and have all these constituents. And it's on the homeowner. And a lot of people prefer not to have the government interfere with their business. So you have both sides of that. At the same time, we have people who aren't informed or even maybe renting a property with a well. They should be protected. In most cases, they're not. I think Vermont's probably the only state I know of that has a law regarding water testing for renters. And that should be universal as well. The I don't want to know example. So I've done a lot of arsenic research in my career, looking at arsenic in groundwater in Illinois, especially. We have a fair amount of it in some of our aquifers. And we looked at why that's the case. Well, one thing, we found some very variable levels of arsenic in homes in the same area, several orders of magnitude different, from less than detection, less than 3 parts per billion, up to 200 or 300 or more. And so we were doing a project where we were sampling a rural subdivision that had 23 homes. Every home had a well. They were all on a 40-acre square. And so we went door to door asking if we could collect samples. First, we did all the information, all that other stuff. And one gentleman said, you can sample my well as long as you do it when I'm not home and you don't send me the results. And I just could not figure out for the life of me why someone would want to do that. And it turned out that in Illinois, there's a form, at least at this time, and this has been a number of years ago, that every homeowner has to fill out that's legally binding. And one of the questions is, do you know anything adverse, basically, about your well water, or septic? And I may be butchering that. If you're an Illinois realtor, yeah, you can correct me. But the bottom line is, he wanted to be able to sign that form and honestly say, I know of no known problems with my well water. And he knew if I sent him those results, he would have to possibly answer that. So there's a lot of reasons why people don't want to test, or why these things are important. And, again, this is in Tazewell County, Illinois. I would not buy a home without testing for arsenic because we know it exists there in the sand and gravel aquifers. So what do you test for? It really depends. If it's a bedrock well, what the geology is. Your local, your state geological survey will have some ideas, as well as your state health department. If there's known contaminants, are you near any sources? Today, the big example would be if you're near an airport, then you might want to sample even for PFAS, because we know that all that firefighting foam and all the tests that are done and all the training that's done on many airport properties has left a lot of them with a lot of PFAS in their ground and sometimes groundwater. You should always ask your county or local health department or state health department for advice. Ask others, ask your co-op extension person in your area, drillers, even labs, if there's any in the area, what things there might be that you might be a risk in this area. And I'll show you some examples of why that's important. And again, lenders may have requirements, they actually do, but we'll talk about some of the issues there too, but you don't want there to be any surprises and something that's going to muck up and delay or even prevent a sale. That doesn't do anyone any good. So as far as natural groundwater quality, you can find a lot of that today on the web. If you just look for groundwater quality of Illinois, you're going to end up going to the Water Survey's website, the State Geological Survey's website, the USGS office that's in Illinois, probably the only Department of Health and Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, IEPA. They all have information. And it's a matter of just taking a little time and looking. There's maps in some cases of known contaminants, or there's testing that's been done. I know in Illinois, we provided some data to our Illinois EPA, and they've developed a GIS swap site where you can look at some of those things. And if you call us in Illinois anyway, we have over 30,000 samples that have collected over the years, and we can look in a database and say, hey, you know, this water's hard, or this water, we know this aquifer tends to have arsenic in it, or all those sorts of things. There are folks like that in most states. I won't say every, because you may have problems. And in general, they all want to help. They all want to make sure that people are being safe, that you understand the water quality and what you're getting yourself into. Yeah, so if you know there's some kind of contaminant that could be a problem, you should test for it before anything else happens. So as some examples, Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection has this nice site where you can type in your address and it'll tell you if, one, if you have a bedrock well, then if there's arsenic or uranium issues in that area. Oh boy, that hasn't happened in a while. It fast forwarded on its own. So this may be an issue the rest of the talk, and I apologize. But so yeah, you can find out if you should test for arsenic or uranium. This next picture is Rhode Island. And the reason that's interesting is all the little dots are where there used to be orchards, and they have arsenic contamination from arsenic being used as a pesticide through up and through the 60s. But that big splotch in the middle is natural occurring beryllium. And I was on their website either this morning or yesterday, and they actually have information about this now. They didn't when I took this screenshot, but it's a regulated contaminant. It has health effects. I'd never heard of that being a groundwater issue. I'm a groundwater hydrologist and have been for for over 35 years, but they have it there and it's actually a health concern. So you want to test for beryllium if you're in this area. And the only way to know that is to go look and find out or ask. If you ask the Rhode Island Department of Health, they would have told you, yeah, you need to sample for beryllium if you're in this county. We know that there's been some issues, and then here's what the health effects are. And that's what the health department's there for. Wisconsin has this really nice site, Wisconsin DNR. All the private wells they've sampled, they have this really cool, and I need to update this because I use this site once in a while, and it's been modified some, and there's a lot more data than there was when I took the screenshot. But I'm looking at arsenic, and you can see the 3 red counties are up by Green Bay. And that means the average arsenic concentration for the wells they sampled in those 3 counties was over 21, which is twice the health standard. So if I'm going to move up to Green Bay, which, yeah, I was going to make a dig at the Packers, but I won't. If I was going to buy a home on a private well, then I would definitely test for arsenic in those areas. There's other parts of even Wisconsin, but of the country, where there are no arsenic issues whatsoever, and it's really not necessary to test there. And the state agency will likely know that. Okay, so here's what we recommend. And again, we're talking to a national audience, so we don't have beryllium in here. We don't have some other things that might be a problem, uranium, for instance, in other states. But in general, this is what we recommend. Again, coliform and nitrate, you test for annually. And those aren't necessarily to show coliform bacteria itself is not a health risk. It's E. coli and some other types of bacteria that are. But if coliform bacteria can get in your well, that means there's a pathway from the surface, and that means you're at risk of other things. The same with elevated nitrate. You know, nitrate is a problem for pregnant women and babies, but once for an adult, it's not regulated as a contaminant because of adults drinking water with high nitrate. It's because of babies and blue baby syndrome. And so, but if it's elevated, that is another way. It's so ubiquitous in the surface environment, that means it's a risk that there's some kind of pathway into your well from the surface, whether that be, you know, the nitrate and coliform could be from a septic system or a feedlot, or it could be some other source. Then every 3 to 5 years, you should really do inorganics and metals. A lot of sites will recommend, you know, this, but it's so that you have an idea of what the general water quality is in your water, and it really shouldn't change. So like for a very shallow aquifer, the water quality can change because it's influenced by the surface. But like the Mahomet sand and gravel aquifer here in Champaign, Illinois, is buried under over 100 feet of clay. And so if I find a well that has higher arsenic, let's say, for example, we have monitoring wells all over the state, and some of them that I put in the 90s, there's 3 or 4 wells that are in the Mahomet Aquifer that have arsenic always around 40 or 50. You know, it's maybe varies. We sample them like every 10 years, and it may vary by 3 or 4 parts per billion. But if it's 40 this time, it's going to be 37 to 43 next time. There's one well that's always less than 3, and it doesn't make sense. It's in the same aquifer, it's out in the same area, but it's pretty far away from any of the other wells, but it's very consistently always less than 3. But if all of a sudden that changed, or if the pH changed significantly, or the alkalinity changed significantly, that tells you that something's changed with your well and where your well's getting its water from. And that's particularly the case with where bedrock may be your water source. If there's been even a small earthquake, that can change. Some fractures may get closed, others may open. We have a well in southern Illinois that we monitor continually for water level. And when one of the faults in Missouri started making noise, this is probably 15 years ago, the water level in that well jumped 2 feet. And it's always been 2 feet higher since. And so a lot of things can change. And so taking a sample every 3 to 5 years is what we would recommend. And then again, also ask your local or state health department for anything that might be a concern in that area. Inform your client and be informed. The more you know about wells and the more you can talk intelligently about issues related to private wells, the better your reputation is going to be. It's that simple. We know that from a fact just from our program. We've been consistent. We've been here 11 years. We've got quite a following now because we've always been willing to help people and take the extra step. That's what makes anyone a good professional. And so provide resources, even consider developing a web page if you do a lot of work with homes on private wells and you need to be more educated than your client. It says here, educate yourself as well as your client. The more you know, the more you'll know if someone's trying to pull the wool over your eyes, even if that's an inspector or a contractor or someone else. We have people who tell us, oh, my well's 80 feet deep. We go to take a water level measurement and we don't even hit water at 80 feet. We find out the well's 250 feet deep. You can't go just on what people think they know. Sometimes they really don't. But being transparent and always being professional and admitting when you don't know something, all those things stand out and help you build your brand and your business. There's also a lot of resources out there. So this is from Connecticut, and just trying to show some examples here. But this is Wisconsin's. So there's a lot of information out there besides from us about your state, your area, things you can learn, all that sort of stuff. And I'm not recommending, I'm not trying to highlight any individual realtor here, but this site stands out because of the amount of work they put into providing information about about private wells. So I want to talk a little bit quickly about our private well class. I mentioned it's 10 lessons, the URL's privatewellclass.org. And now we have this national hotline and help center, which I'll show you in a minute, that really allow us to, one, help more people and get a lot more information out there that you can find on your own, as well as then when there's a real challenging problem, we have folks who can help deal with that. So this is our front page. You can either click on the green button that says take our free class, takes you to a page to sign up, or visit our help center if you have a question, and that I'll show you that in a minute. But if you sign up for the class, we just ask for your first name and where you live as a drop down for what state you're in. That's really for us to count beans for our sponsor. The people that fund us want to know that our program is really nationwide and actually extends to tribal areas and territories. And so we're able to do that when everyone signs up if they just fill that out. Obviously, we need an email address so that we can send the lessons to you. They come as a PDF once a week for 10 weeks. We have a Spanish version. If you're in an area where there's a lot of native Spanish speakers, you can take the class there. And as well as, here's one of the pages done in Spanish. Even the figures have all been changed. You can see that That figure 1 at the top, at the end says, the source is the Minnesota Department of Health, but it's all been done so that it's friendly for anyone who's a native Spanish speaker, and they can get through that that way. For each of the lessons, there's 10, as I mentioned. The first lesson is called The Science of Groundwater. If the 6 to 10 pages of the lesson that we put together doesn't resonate, or there's questions you still have, we put together some other resources from other sources where you can go to those, learn more about specific topics that are within what we provided. We didn't write 10 books. We wrote 10 6 to 10 page lessons that give people a good overview, consider it like a well or 101, but then we provided resources that really help if you have specific situations. Like under lesson 2, the first thing is the Michigan Flowing Well Handbook. Michigan, it's a really cool handbook because they passed a law that requires you to cap flowing wells. They have so many flowing wells. At one time, they were losing 28 million gallons of groundwater a day to the surface for wells just flowing because of the pressure on the system. So it's an interesting story. We put together this webinar along with any of the others we've done are all recorded. In June 2023, we did a webinar on outreach strategies for how to work with private well owners. This is really was meant for like county health departments or extension and folks that are trying to really get educational materials or public health materials out to them. At the end of those, just like the end of this one, there's a lot of questions that we answer. So they're all valuable to go through, even just to look at what questions we answered and if they might be relevant for you. The other big question we get is about funding and financing. There aren't a lot of options, but there are some, especially for low income folks. And so this goes through a lot of those possibilities. And we talk about, again, about why you need to be inquisitive and investigate what might be available in your area. If you're in Iowa, for instance, the Grants to Counties program, you talk to your county health department. They'll may be able to provide free testing or help with abandoning a well or other things, including adding treatment if you have the right situation. And so that's how you find out about all those things. We've done some specialty webinars. We did this lead webinar twice, once in 2016 and once in 2018. Excuse me. There's really no reason to do it again for private well owners because the problems are still the same problems. So if you have lead pipes or galvanized pipes or lead solder and copper pipes or bronze fittings, all those things contain lead. Depending on the quality of your water, it can allow it to leach and then it comes out in your drinking water. There are ways to treat it. We actually created a website that's just privatewellclass.org/lead. I think that's right here. So you can look at what information is available related to getting certified products for lead reduction, like a filter on your kitchen tap or a filter for a pitcher that will help reduce that risk and those sorts of things. We have a number of videos that we've created. We call them training videos. There's 19, I think, now on individual topics. How does my pressure tank work? What to know about a shared well. It's amazing how many homes are actually sharing wells. And if there aren't the right contracts in place or it's not in the deed or all those things, you can really take a neighbor and become not very friendly when a pump fails and all of a sudden you need to come up with $5,000 and no one wants to take responsibility. Or someone else buys the property that actually has the well on it and there's nothing in place that prevents them from saying, I don't want to share my well anymore, and the other people on that well are now out of luck. Those things happen. I get calls about it more than I would have ever guessed from all over the country. So it's an issue. Why does my well keep losing pressure and how does my pressure tank work? Two of the most popular videos we have, this has had over, how does my pressure tank work? I think it's had over 400,000 hits since we launched that in 2016. We have a podcast called Tap Talk. It's really geared towards rural health and drinking water. And we interview folks on the private well side and on the public water side. We have a sister program called wateroperator.org that's supporting water and wastewater operators for communities of under 10,000 people. And really it's there to support systems with 500 people, 200 homes, 300 homes that still have public water supplies. They have a lot of scale issues where they can't, because of economies of scale, they have a lot more issues trying to stay in compliance with all the rules. And so we interview folks on both sides. Some of them are pretty interesting. Dr. Alan Wolf is the head of pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital at Harvard Medical School. He deals with patients, kids, who sometimes those issues relate back to their private well. So some interesting reading. We also have partner resources. I won't go into a lot about those, but we have a newsletter that goes out once a month as a professional. If you want to sign up for that, we try to put some really good information in there about what's going on, resources that are available, things like that. This is an older one. Again, this is that well sealing demonstration I mentioned in Macomb, Illinois. That's the driller putting bentonite chips, which are clay. Once they saturate, that whole thing seals like a plug, and water can't get down in it. This is just another video. We've put on 4 conferences. 2 of them were in person, and 2 have been remote or virtual on professional issues. They're really for extension and health departments and other professionals who are interested in learning more about how to help the well owners they serve. I do want to mention this brochure. We put this together with the idea that as a professional, you could hand it out to your clients, or a health department can hand it out to the people who come in to get a water test or whatever it might be. And so it really just describes, is your well water safe? Here's some information about why you should test, some best practices you should follow, and why you should consider taking our class. It's free, it's non-biased, we're not selling anything, and it provides a lot of good information. And so we've created that, and we left this big spot in the middle so that we can give these like to a health department, and they can stick their own label on it with their information, contact information. And this has been really successful. We've provided these brochures to probably 500 or 600 different organizations. Oh yeah, it's also available in Spanish, but we've printed 93,000 of these already and handed them out. And so, it's actually been a great approach to reaching folks and helping them understand that, this class is available, it's out there. Let us know if you're interested in any. They're free. We print them, we ship them. You just have to hand them out. We started a new website called decentralizedwastewater.org just this year, and it's really to serve the professional on-site community, so pumpers, installers, inspectors. And so there's information about training they can take. They have to maintain a license. There's also a lot of information on septic and on-site systems if you go to the resource library. So if you're interested in those topics, it's still being built, if you will. There's a lot of information already there, and we have launched it, but we find new information almost every day to add. And so in 6 more months, it'll even be that much more robust. But if those are some issues you're interested in, this is a really cool new site we put together. And then going back to the hotline and help center. So again, Sally Dolan and Aaron Huggett manage this. And if you click on Visit the Help Center on our front page, it takes you to this page. There's a chat bot where you can ask a question. It'll take all the information we put into this database, which is called the Knowledge Base by this company that we're working with. It'll create an answer based on all of the answers that are related to that topic. It's actually really great in that respect because it only uses the information we give it. It's not going out on the web and finding some crazy answer. It's just using our material. So we put all the stuff that we want in there, and then it creates an answer. You can also just search using the bar at the top. And if there's an article, which are these, so it's 33 articles, 5 articles here on each of these. Or you can call us, and you'll get either Sally or Aaron most of the time. Katie once in a while. Me probably less than I should be on there, but that's how things are. But if you want to just search, I just type the word flood, and these are the articles that mention that. So you can click on those. This is actually a video we put together. It's one of those 19 videos I mentioned. What do you do after a well's been flooded? And it really depends on the well type and what's going on, if the well was overtopped, all those things. But that's all described in this article as you go down the page. And so it's really helpful. We've had tons of people use it already. I think when I looked at the last progress report, There have been over 4,000 articles viewed in less than 3 months. And so that's awesome. And we think that's going to grow. But our goal with our program is really these things: to help well owners understand why their well is important, why they should understand how it works, and what they can do to help protect themselves from risk. And so working with professionals like realtors, labs, environmental health professionals, extension, we're helping you be prepared to help the people you serve. And so, and really it's, you can reach, if you reach 5 well owners, that's 5 more people than what we've been able to reach by them coming directly to us. But they're always welcome to come back to us, right? And we're there to help answer questions from you or them. And so keep that in mind. We're here to help and help people understand more about their wells to help protect themselves from risk is the bottom line. So we did get a lot of questions. Again, Katie is taking questions. If you want to put that in the chat or the question box. I've never figured out with GoToWebinar whether you all see a chat box, a box for chat or a box for questions or both. And it's been some in all those cases, and it still is. But we'll get to those at the very end. What we've done for right now is we've taken the questions that you all asked in advance, and we picked some of those to answer today. We only have 20 more minutes. So anyway, there's other webinars. This last bullet I didn't update, and I made a mistake there. But so someone asked about sulfur, I guess, yeah. Anyway, I'll talk about that at the very end, because our past webinars all do have other questions that might not have been asked today or that we didn't get to today that were asked today. So I'm going to talk about PFAS first, because it's such a big issue, and I know it's a concern for everyone. And this is a really good question, in that will PFAS be a required test for homeowners who want to sell their property? Well, I went and looked at New Jersey's webpage to see if they require it, because I know they didn't, but they do now. And so there's 3 PFAS compounds. You can go to their website. If you just Google New Jersey private well testing, and then look at the requirements for that act, that's a law, you'll find the list of constituents that they require. But it's really a state by state or even local jurisdiction, which I kind of explained earlier. There are some county health departments or local health districts who may have their own rules, depending on the authority they actually have. And in home rule states, sometimes they have actually a lot of authority to decide issues related to private wells. So New Jersey's law has been there, I think I saw on the earlier slide, since 2002, so 22 years. And I think I've talked enough about that. And I also talked about Rhode Island. And I went to Rhode Island's website to check, and they do not require PFAS testing. They talk about it a lot. They have a standard for a public water supply or community water supply, but they don't have a requirement for private wells, even through their act that requires testing at home sale. So, but in my opinion, as these issues become more prevalent, and we also find that PFAS is even more common than people realize, which I think is where we're headed, it seems probable that more states are going to consider these rules. Or lenders are, because they tend to be first, right? As a realtor, you probably know this a lot better than I do. It's lender requirements that have led to a lot of testing that happens even today, because it's really a public health concern. And for a lender or a mortgage company, it's also protecting the value of their loan. If you find out a well is not usable and the people have to leave the house and they default on their loan, that's obviously a problem. And so they're protecting their investment, which they should do and have every right to do. What are your thoughts on PFAS testing? So I'm going to caveat this and say these are my personal thoughts. If you're going to talk to someone about PFAS and health risks, you should talk to a health professional at your state health department. I didn't add county health departments here because most of them are too small to have someone who really has a breadth of knowledge about PFAS issues, but a state toxicologist is very likely to have that expertise, and that's who I would recommend you talk to from a health standpoint. But what I know about PFAS and what I've learned from the questions we get, not only for these webinars, but from people who call us, they're everywhere. They're in the air, they're on dust, they're on your clothes, they're in our bodies already. There's so many things we still don't know. I was at an EHA conference this summer, which is the National Environmental Health Association, and the speaker mentioned that there's also PFAS formulations that are patented because they're proprietary for things like, not only the firefighting foam stuff, but like the stuff for your jacket to make it waterproof. And so because of that, no one really knows how many different PFAS compounds there actually are. And that's a scary thought, right? It is for me too. But anecdotally, I talked to a state agency where they've started sampling hundreds of private wells on their own for PFAS chemicals, and almost 50% have had detectable levels. So to be clear, detectable does not mean it's over the health standard that the EPA set. It means it was detected. So when you look at a lab report, it'll have an MDL, which is the method detection limit. That means that's the lowest value that their equipment can actually pick up. If it's less than that, it's going to show as non-detect. There could be less, there could be some value lower than that that's actually in there, but they can't detect it because of the quality of the equipment. You can't get down to zero. No equipment does that. In fact, if you look at the history of sampling for arsenic, there was a time when you could only detect arsenic under 15 or 20, 40 years ago, where now the standard's 10, right? And we can detect down in much lower levels. But what that tells me about finding all these PFAS chemicals is we're going to find them wherever we look. And as more and more is done, we have to live with that fact that it's just there. And what it comes down to for anyone who's concerned is you really just need to understand where the risks are, what they are, learn what they are, knowing if there are any potential sources in your area, or if there's things you use regularly that may be high in PFAS. So we had a small community contact us that are all on private wells. It's only about 40 homes, and it's in this really pristine, beautiful area. It's a fairly wealthy area. They had the money to do their own sampling. They don't have no airport there. There's no known sources. And when they sampled their homes on their own, about 30% came back with PFAS. Most were low, a few weren't that low. Few would have been over the standard set today by the US EPA. But I reached out to a number of PFAS experts, and the bottom line is it's likely because of their septic. And that's because of the things we use in our homes, even shampoo, right? Bug spray, all those things have PFAS in it. It's getting in their septic and it's making its way. It's called forever chemicals because they don't degrade. And so those things, I mean, the way I look at it is this next sentence: you can't use a type of chemical in everyday items like skillets and rain jackets for the last 70 years and many hundreds of other things and not expect it to be everywhere. We just didn't realize what we were doing. And now that we know, you can't take that genie out of the bottle, especially in the short term. I really think we'll be having the same conversation in 20 years, my opinion. But there's no way to deal with it all at once or to get rid of it all at once. And luckily, there are methods to remove PFAS from water, but eventually, there's all those things. So I would test once, caveating that it's expensive. So if, it could be cost prohibitive for a lot of people. And so then you need to look at all the other things I said about knowing if there's risks, knowing if there are sources nearby, and then really it becomes a personal decision, right? And that's just unfortunate, honestly. And hopefully as we move forward and more of this testing is done, the costs will come down, programs will be developed so that folks can test for PFAS, or maybe even have some other organization or government entity that provides some of the cost or all the cost for that kind of testing. And I think that's already starting, but I don't have any examples. But it's just, this isn't going to go away. This is the bottom line. So how does it benefit real estate professionals to require and encourage well inspections on behalf of their clients? How might an agent be impacted by selling a home with a bad or illegal well? This kind of question, I'll be just honest, frustrates me. It's a word I'll use because it's really like, do we really need to do this? And, why should we care, sort of thing. And maybe that's not the intent it was meant, but that's the way it looks to me. And so hopefully I've already answered this, but it's really just, it comes down to it's simply your job. I mean, your job is to do right by your client on either side. And you're not doing them any favors if you don't do the well inspection, whether you're the buyer or the seller. And you're certainly not helping anyone if it comes back that the well's bad or illegal or whatever term you want to use. And eventually, if you're not professional, it's going to affect your business, and it's going to, you probably won't be in the business that long. Especially, you know, at least around here, real estate is very competitive. Selling real estate is a very competitive industry. And yeah, I really think it's about your reputation and caring about your clients and things that, you know, don't answer your question, but how I view the world. And so 2 examples. The first one is the arsenic one, which I didn't realize when I wrote this answer that I'd already talked about. That's the guy that didn't want to write on the real estate form that he knew something bad about as well. But the other example is about HUD. And I know there was a question about HUD, so we're dealing with that all here. There's a lot of misinformation still floating around about what's required for a HUD, VA, or USDA loan. This diagram below with all these values, some mortgage company in Michigan took a piece of a mortgagee letter from HUD from 1994, put it on a brand new piece of paper and made a fancy PDF so it looks nice, and said, this is what HUD requires. It is what they required in 1994, and that mortgagee letter has been superseded. It's not what they require today at all. And if people give advice or they use this, and even if they convince, you know, a bank to lend the money because they've met the HUD's requirements, that's not true. It's wrong. What it says today is that there is no list. You have to go by what's the local jurisdiction's rules, or if there's no local jurisdiction, then the state rules. And if there's no state rules, it says to use what the EPA requires for community water supplies, which let me go through that. Mortgagee must confirm, first of all, if you're anywhere near a public water supply, now they require you, if it's feasible and a reasonable cost, to hook up to a public water supply, community water system, because it's safe, it's tested regularly, it will guarantee you that the water will always be acceptable and there will always be water available. So that's, you know, there's 3 concerns HUD does: water quality, water quantity, and rules related to sharing wells. And if you, I'll show you where that's at in a minute. But so first, you have to find out if there's a public water supply available, and if there is, you have to see if it's feasible to connect. And that's, you know, raise the hands of, you know, how many people actually do that? Probably none. But second, if you do have a well and it's going to be there, when an individual water supply system is present, the mortgagee must ensure that the water quality meets the requirements of the health authority with jurisdiction. If there are no local or state water quality standards, which is most states, then the water quality must meet the standards set by the EPA for the National Drinking Water, Primary Drinking Water Regulations. So no one does this. That's why that mortgagee letter was being used. Excuse me, I need to take a drink real quick. Because it's honestly ridiculous to require all of the primary drinking water standards. Some of them are surface water related, like for algal blooms and things like that, that you'll never have in a well. But this is the most recent version of HUD document 4000.1. And if you just Google HUD 4000.1, it's the May 24 edition. It took effect August 19th. I just looked at it this morning. But these are the National Primary Drinking Water Standards. There's 7 pages. This is half of a page of all the things that a community has to test for and make sure their waters doesn't have it in it, or they can treat to take it out. Again, no one does this. It's not the public health goal per se. It's what the MCLs are, which is the maximum contaminant level allowed by law, the second column, not the last column. But it's a huge list that would cost probably $2,000 or $3,000 at least to test for. Yeah, it's intimidating. So when you go back to this, this is also not the rule. And so there needs to be some happy medium when you're in a state that doesn't have any rules or a local jurisdiction that has no rules, because this is wrong. And if anyone's using this, it could come back to bite you. I reached out to a group that's been providing letters to mortgage companies and realtors on behalf of saying this meets what the HUD's rules are, and said, do you realize this is a problem? They told me to take a hike. So I've tried to reach out to HUD. That's also another animal, the giant animal that I haven't had any success with. But if you have any ins there, it'd be great, because I think something needs to change, like an actual set of rules that make sense for homes on private wells that takes into account local contaminants and things like that. Does changing climate weather impact your well water activities? And yeah, so the bottom line is, last month, August 27th, we gave a presentation on impacts of drought and flooding on private wells. If you go to our webpage, you don't have to know this entire long string at the bottom. If you go to our YouTube channel and just look for our monthly webinars, it'll be the most current one there today, because this one isn't up yet since we haven't finished it today. A lot of information about some of those issues and resources and things we've learned. There was also a really good pre-conference workshop at NEHA on impacts of flooding, and 3 or 4 speakers, several from North Carolina, where they've had both North Carolina and Virginia Tech have done a lot of work in that area. And so if you can get to those resources, they're probably worth looking at. PFAS testing requirements. Oh, look at this. So I got in a hurry this morning and I added a couple questions, and I forgot to change this title. This should say, this is about hydrogen sulfide and that rotten egg smell. So the question is, well water is treated with UV light and water softener. The cold water has no smell. However, the hot water had smell. So recently replaced that, and after a few months it came back. That's because it's not the water heater that's the problem. It's the magnesium dot anode, the rod that's in it, in all likelihood. But if you just Google Minnesota Department of Health hydrogen sulfide and get to this document, it explains, it's got a little tree that explains if it's this, if it's just hot water, it means this. If it's both, it means, here's what you need to look at. They're the professionals on this, and actually it's a really good document we provide and share with people a lot. Some additional questions I thought I'd answer quickly. How to deal with water pressure issues from wells. So we have a video on how your pressure tank works, and unless it's one of the new systems that has, the half-gallon or gallon pressure tank and uses a variable speed drive pump, it's really where you put your settings. So you can set a lot of these water heaters either with a low pressure and a high pressure that varies. So you can make it at 2040 or 3060. But if you have 2 stories and you're using the low end of those values, what that means is the pump kicks on when the pressure tank gets below 20, for instance, and it shuts off when the pressure tank gets up to 40 psi pressure. That may not be enough for a home. And if there's other issues and the pressure stays low, you may want to check. It could be that the pump is kicking on and off regularly. That means there's probably a problem with the diaphragm in your pressure tank, and it's not holding pressure, it's leaking. So there's this video we have probably has some good resources for that, and you can find that on our YouTube channel. Who to contact about regulations. If you're in a home rule state, you also want to contact your local health district, but it would be your state agency that either licenses drillers or maintains a well construction code, or if like Pennsylvania has neither of those, it'd be the state agency that regulates public water supplies. And they're either going to know or they're going to be able to give you the contact for what regulations might exist, whether that's related to well construction or testing or even probably septic systems. They're going to know who the right agency is to get a hold of if it's not them. So what are the risks regarding contamination from septic? Well, really, your septic system is full of bacteria and all the things that we discharge through our toilets and showers and everything else. And bacteria in the septic tank from our stomachs are what break down all the material. that eventually then that gets pumped out, the solids, but the liquids then are broken down and they go into the soil where they percolate down, and bacteria in the soil actually do more remediation and basically take care of all of that. There could be a shortened pathway if there's a sand lens, a thin sand layer of geology close to the surface, where all the water from your drain field is running right back to your well, or the same thing from, you get a feedlot. There's a lot of things that can happen. Or your drain field is plugged because it hasn't been maintained and you haven't pumped your septic tank. And so instead of backing up into your house, it comes out through your yard. And someone sent me a video one time of their beautifully sodded yard that had been there for a couple of years. And when they pushed down on it, you could see a wave of the grass moving across, because underneath it was a layer of water and septic stuff that had been building up because their tank was plugged. So regarding contamination, it's really bacteria, E. coli. There's other things certainly that could be. I'm not an expert on the types of bacteria that cause disease, but we consider anything where you could have E. coli or coliform as also, Giardia, Pseudomonas, things that exist in groundwater that could be a problem as well. And lastly, it's after 3, sorry, are there requirements when more than one home uses the same well? It really depends on your state. I know there's some rules in New York for homes that are when there's more than 5. Washington State regulates as a special type of water supply, public water supply, anytime there's 2 or more homes on a well. Most states do not. They follow the federal regs, which are, it's considered a private water source if it's less than 15 homes or less than 25 people. So for a while in Illinois, for instance, we had contractors who were putting subdivisions in rural areas where they'd only put 1 well in every 5 to 7 homes and connect everybody to it because it was cheaper for them. And they did everyone such a disservice. Now all those folks are having to deal with, there's a well on one person's property that has all the control. How do you do that? We've seen very unique situations where they have, everyone pays a water bill anyway, and they pay it to one person. They're supposed to maintain it. I just had a person in Northern Illinois where the person who was maintaining all that's been spending the money, and now they have a problem and there's no money, so all their neighbors are mad at them. And they're just, it's a bad idea to share a well unless it's all written out in a contract or some kind of agreement that's legally binding. I do want to mention again, our other webinars all have questions like the ones I just answered, but they're likely to be different. Like one question we didn't answer this time, but we have many times, is how to disinfect a well. And so I encourage you to go back, and if you asked a question that's related, it's a common question, or if it's about typical well care type stuff or more about groundwater and wells, the first half will be some of the slides like I showed today, about well construction or what to sample for. The last half will be all the questions that we answered that month, and they're on our YouTube channel, and you can learn a lot from going through those. We're trying to put those into the help center. We haven't got that done yet, but some of them are certainly there. So I'm going to get out of this. It's already after 3. I'm going to go to the questions, and let me make this full screen and larger. It says ready to update. I don't want to do that. Okay, so first question. Existing public water supply, existing city public water main nearby, less than 500 feet. There's a vacant property not in the city. Does the state require the builder to connect to the existing water main instead of digging a new well? If so, the builder would need to extend the public water main to serve the new homes, which is expensive. That's dependent on the rules in the state or the property that the city claims as part of their quote territory or whatever. They may have rules depending on where their actual well is for the community water supply that won't allow you to put a well in that close to their water system. There's a lot of factors there. I would consider seriously hooking to the city water supply if you can. Maintaining a public water supply to build some kind of larger building to serve the new homes. Yeah, I mean, I think in the long run, you're serving the folks there, and you will make the homes more sellable if you have city water. I just had a case in Southern Illinois where a homeowner, her husband has cancer, it's terminal. I went and met with them to look at their well. They wanted to blame the farm that's, within the farm ground that's within 20 feet of their well. They had their garden right next to the well. And after talking to them for several hours, it came up that right across the road is a rural water line for a public water supply that they had the chance to hook up to 25 years ago, and they chose not to. And it made me sick to my stomach because it's, there's no way to prove, I don't think, and that's what I told them, not to spend the money on testing their water now for pesticides, because the pesticides in their well today aren't necessarily what might have caused their problem. And because it's a farm, there's so many other possible sources that you would never be able to prove that. But if they would have hooked to a public water supply, you don't know for sure that this wouldn't have happened, but it would have eliminated one possible source. And so the gentleman's wife asked me, she said, well, I'm probably going to sell our home and move into town eventually. Should I hook to the water line, even though now it's $6,000? And I said, it will make your house worth much more than $6,000. It'll add way more than $6,000 of value to your home to be hooked to a public water supply than to have this old 25-foot dug well in your front yard. That's the facts. So I would always lean towards hooking to a public water supply. Even if it's more expensive today, I think you could recoup that in the value of the homes. But that's a conversation for the contractor or the folks, the builder, to do. In terms of urban pesticides, can you make some comments? Any requirements out there? We know that a green lawn is a big deal in real estate. What pesticides are out there? Well, especially in an urban environment, you don't expect to see a lot of wells. But all of that comes down to the type of well and where the water's coming from, because I do get asked all the time, my backyard backs up to a farm field. Should I be worried about pesticides? So what I usually say is, well, if you're here in Champaign County and you have a properly constructed well that the grout around the outside of the casing is solid and your water's coming from 200 feet below land surface, those pesticides are never going to reach the well screen and cause problems. And so in that case, you don't have to worry. You shouldn't have to worry about pesticides. I might test once to be sure, once the well's been in place, but the only way that could happen is if there's a breach in the well, a crack in the casing, or the grout wasn't in place like it's supposed to be, which there's a lot of rules to help make sure that doesn't happen. But if you have an old dug well or even a modern bored well that's only 30 feet deep and it's right next to a farm field, and there's those concrete seams are less than 20 feet below land surface, then there's certainly some risk there. I don't know about any requirements per se. The only requirements are the installation of a well, as far as the setback from all the things that I showed earlier. But yeah, in a lot of cases, those pesticides to make your grass green shouldn't, and herbicides and fertilizer shouldn't be a problem if the well's properly protected and the water's coming from a deeper source. And that's what you need to know. So, all right, that's all we have. I did run 10 minutes long. I apologize. Thank you for staying, for those that did. And if you have any further questions, here's our email. And also, if you're looking to get a certificate or want to get CEs for today, hopefully, if this isn't your first time, you know what to do. We are a small crew, so please give us time. Sometimes it may take a week or two before we get back to you. Don't bombard us with emails. Our staff are really good at what they do. It just takes time, and we will get to you. Or we'll give you a reason not. Sometimes folks are only on the call for 20% of the time, and they call us or email us and want a certificate. That's not going to happen. So thank you. And if If you have any further questions, you can get to us at that email. In about an hour or two, you're going to get an email saying thanks for attending. That'll have my email address on it. You're free to contact me if you want to follow up with anything I've said today. All right, thanks. Take care.